So this is a great treat for me, as it's going to be for all of y'all. I am a big admirer of both of our speakers, and I also am hugely interested in this topic. So I'm going to pretend like I'm asking questions for your benefit of them, but really this is all being staged, so I can ask some questions I wanted to ask and meet some people I wanted to meet. As Jeff said, the plan will be, unless we run out of things to talk about, which I think is kind of unlikely, we'll go for 30, 40, at most 45 minutes, and I'll make sure that we leave a solid half hour for y'all to ask the questions that I leave out and to raise the topics that don't get introduced. So I'm just going to start firing away. And I thought I would start at a pretty general level, sort of a definitional level, and then just go through a series of issues. So the first question I wanted to ask, and I'll start with Jim on this, although this is one I think they can both speak to, is one of the things we want to talk about. We're going to talk a lot about capitalism, but we also want to talk about justice and the relationship between capitalism and justice, and the relationship between capitalism and social justice. So the question I want to ask is, what should we be thinking about when we're thinking about justice? And is social justice the same thing as justice, or are they different things? How should we think about those issues? Let's start with you, Jim.
Terrific. Well, first of all, I'll announce for the record that we did not get the questions before, at least not.
The curveballs have begun.
The curveballs have begun. Bring them on. So what's the connection between capitalism and justice?
Or what is justice? We'll get to the capitalism and justice.
What is justice?
So what is
start
justice?
with an easy question.
Is justice the same thing as social justice, or are they different?
Let's start with that. I think the answer to whether justice and social justice are the same is no. And the reason for that is that people who talk about social justice typically don't talk about justice, or they don't think it's the same thing. So the whole reason for having a term like social justice is to distinguish it from justice. But we can think about this. I'm interested to hear what Ron has to say about this. But we can think about this, I think, helpfully by looking to one of the forefathers of capitalism, namely Adam Smith. Adam Smith actually wrote two books, not one. The book you may have heard of is called The Wealth of Nations. Its full title is actually An Inquiry into the Nature and Causes of the Wealth of Nations, which is important to understand what the project of that book was about. But in his first book, he only wrote two books. I'm not sure he would get tenure at a modern university. His first book was called The Theory of Moral Sentiments. And this was an investigation into how it is that human beings come to have moral sentiments. How do they form their moral judgment? In that book, Smith distinguishes the moral virtues into two very large, broad categories. One category he calls justice. The other category is everything else. And this, I think, is instructive for thinking about the kind of system of political economy that came to be associated with capitalism that was developed in The Wealth of Nations. So here's what he had in mind. Justice, he says, is a fairly simple thing. You can capture it in just a couple of rules, whereas all of the other virtues require indefinitely many virtues and activities to engage in. So justice he called a negative virtue. Justice is not assaulting people, stealing from people, and breaking promises. Just those three things. So justice is negative, he said, in the sense that you can fulfill all of the rules of justice just by leaving people alone. As he famously said, we fulfill all the rules of justice by sitting still and doing nothing. So right now, each of us in this room is respecting justice with respect to everyone else. So justice is just a few rules what not to do to other people. That's very easy to follow, easy to understand. It's also fairly easy to see infractions of it. So if someone has assaulted you, stolen from you, or broken a contract or promise, typically those things are fairly easy to see, to rectify, etc. On the other hand, the other branch of virtues are all the positive actions that are required for people to do to lead a fully virtuous, a fully humane life. Those are a very different very different kettle of fish. Negative virtues, I can sit still and do nothing. If I want to act positively, so the virtues he calls beneficence, friendship, generosity, loyalty, compassion, all of the things that require us to take positive, not just sit still and do nothing, but to take positive action to help other people, this requires a new element. And the new element is I have to know something about the object of my actions. If I'm actually going to help you, And if my help is going to actually be help, I have to know an awful lot about you. It's very difficult to do. It's actually much more difficult than you might think to help another person. That requires quite a bit of knowledge, not only of my own situation, but also of your situation. How is it that you came to be in the situation you are? What kinds of things would help you? What kinds of things wouldn't help you? What kinds of things might I do for you that would actually be counterproductive? The only way I can come to a determination about that is by knowing a lot about you. So what Smith said we ought to do is, the rules of justice are clear. They apply to all people, whether you know them or not. You should respect the rules of justice with respect to them at all times. Those are exactly the sorts of things that we could enforce and should enforce by means of the state. This is what the government should do. The positive virtues, those things can't be known by a third party, a distant third party. No one who doesn't know you can know what the things are that are required to help you. So those place burdens on us individually to act locally. So for Smith, and then ultimately for the capitalism that develops out of Smith's view, justice is global, beneficence is local. So respect justice with respect to all people, your people in your country, other countries. Beneficence, doing good for others, do that where you know that what you're doing is actually something that can help.
And how does social justice fit into that? Is that on one side of that line? Or
So I think what social justice means different things to different people. But I think one way to understand social justice uncontroversially is trying to incorporate some of those positive actions into the conception of justice. So instead of seeing it as two categories, negative justice is keeping your word, keeping your hands to yourself, not assaulting people. But we want to incorporate some of those positive actions into what's required by justice. Now, one of the upshots of that is that if justice is something that the state or that the government or that the community has by right the authority to enforce, if we start incorporating some of the positive virtues into it as well, then that means that the state might have a right or authority to enforce those as well. That's what Smith thought was a mistake. Those are moral responsibilities that fall on individuals as individuals, possibly in concert with in their localized communities, but should not be part of what the state enforces coercively.
Ron, does that sound right to you, or would you define those terms differently, or bring in other factors?
Well, I certainly start very differently. I go back to the Bible rather than that. No, that's not.
Low blows come later. We start without the low blows.
Aristotle said that justice exists when each person gets his due. I would broaden it to say justice exists when persons and institutions receive their due. But of course, you need content to talk about what is due. And for my definition of justice, I tend to go back to the scriptures, especially back to the Old Testament, and I ask, what understanding of justice emerges there. One of the huge debates of the 20th century, which continues, is whether or not justice is only procedural. Are things just if the procedures are fair, honest, open, etc., no matter what the outcome, or is justice also distributive? And I struggle with that in terms of the Old Testament discussion. The two key words in Hebrew are mishpat and tzedakah, and it seems to me quite clear when you look at those words that they mean both procedural justice. There are very clear statements about the fact that the court should not be biased against the rich or the poor, or in favor of either. So procedural justice is clearly important for the prophets, and obviously it's important for all of us now. But the same words are used by the prophets to talk about economic justice in the sense of fair outcomes. And when I try to get a definition of what economic justice would look like, one of the places I go is to the Old Testament and the discussion of land. It's an agricultural society, so land is the basic capital. And what happens? It certainly isn't all, in fact, very little is owned by the state, by the king. It's not owned by a few wealthy people. Every family gets their own land. And there are measures like the Jubilee. Every Jubilee, the land is supposed to go back to the original owners. The prophets shout and scream when a few powerful people around the king in the time of David and the kings after him acquired more and more land, seized the land of poor people, and poor farmers can't have a decent living anymore. They say the nation's going to go into captivity because of that. And then they say when the Messiah comes sometime in the future, everyone will sit under his own vine and his own fig tree. They'll have their land back and be secure. So I get out of that a one-sentence definition of economic justice, which is that God wants every person and family to have access to the productive resources so that if they work responsibly, they can earn their own way and be dignified members of society. That's kind of very briefly my definition of justice. I think when I use the phrase social justice, I tend to be talking. I don't think I've thought carefully about whether or not there's an important distinction there, but I tend to think about what in society is just and fair, and what changes we should make to, in fact, make the structures and the systems of society more fair.
So let me follow up on that and introduce capitalism into this discussion and ask you sort of an unfair question given the context you've just set. What is good about capitalism? I mean, and to the extent that it links to justice, more the better. What are the virtues of capitalism?
Well, I'm actually in print on that.
As on many things.
Carl Henry once called me a Marxist. My one comment or response to that is to say, I'm a Mennonite farm boy, for Pete's sake. Have you ever met a Mennonite farmer who wants the government to own his land? I don't. I think they're both, kind of theoretical, finally, biblical, theological, ethical kinds of reasons and practical reasons why I say, and have for a long time, that in my lifetime there were two basic options in the economic sphere. One was essentially a Marxist, communist economic order where the government owned the means of production and made the basic decisions. The other was a market economy with private ownership. And I think that there's no doubt, but the better of those two for a starting point for economics is a market economy. Now, my kids or grandkids may figure out major improvement on market economy, that'll be great, but from where I sit, that's the right starting point, partly because God created persons free, and each individual is important, and if a few people at the top make all the decisions, you can't carry out your mandate to be free and responsible, in fact your creation mandate. It's partly because of the fall. If you concentrate power, you're almost certainly to get totalitarianism. And if you concentrate political and economic power, which you do in a communist system, then you're almost guaranteed to get a totalitarian outcome. So I think those two things, at least, would, as kind of principled points, point you away from a communist system toward a decentralized market economy. Now you can get, of course, a lot of centralized power in some market economies today. That we can talk about that, but that's the one side. The other side is just the practical one that economists and everybody else point out. Market economies are more efficient. I believe it was an agency in Moscow that used to make 25 million decisions on prices and how much to produce. And nobody knows enough to do that wisely. Market economies just work better and have produced enormous wealth in my lifetime.
That's
Great. And I think this is my last unfair question, and that is, Jim, what are some of the problems with capitalism? Why is capitalism flawed? And you all know this already, but I'm asking each of them to answer the question against the thrust of their writing. So, what are the problems with Adam Smith's world? Jim?
Well, the first answer to the question of why capitalism is flawed is because capitalism is staffed by human beings who are flawed. There is no system of social institutions that apply to human beings that is not flawed. They are, because we are fallen, we are all flawed. So there's no contest and there's no fair question to ask what's the perfect system versus what do we have, because there is no perfect system. Unfortunately, what we have to do is look at what are the least bad systems. What are the ways in which we can minimize the bad effects that can always arise when you have human beings with their hands on the levers of power. But if we want to push that a little further, what are some of the other problems that capitalism? You mentioned that someone called you a Marxist. I forgot who it was that called you a Marxist. The term capitalist was a Marxist term. It wasn't one that Smith used. Smith talked about capital and capitals and investing capital. But this term capitalist is a Marxian term, but it captures something important, I think. What can happen, and I think what often does happen, is that it's easy to make the mistake to think that, remember the distinction I made between this, for Smith, that justice, the negative justice, and then all the positive virtues. It's easy to make the mistake, which is a mistake, that all I need to do to be a moral person is respect justice. That's it. I don't have to engage in any positive behaviors, and I think if I transfer the focus of my attention to, say, try to put it neutrally, making my family's life better, earning more money, producing more wealth, I won't say being selfish or acquisitive or something like that, trying to better my condition or better our own condition, that can turn the focus of my attention to something far narrower than it might otherwise be. I think that does in fact happen under capitalism. You get people who spend their time thinking about, you might remember, I don't know if there are any Marx scholars here, but Marx talks about something he calls the fetishism of capitalism. Think about that term. If you hear fetish, what are the connotations you think of? Yeah, those were what Marx had in mind too. Sort of the idea of people that what does the capitalist do? He wants to sort of roll around in the money, and that's really all he thinks about is money and making more money, and he stops thinking about human beings as human beings and sees them only as means to his end to make money. That I think is an important thing to keep in mind. I think it's a danger, and it's not just a danger. I think it can happen. People who deal with one another only as insofar as they are either business partners or potential business partners can come to see each other as means to an end. I see you not as a human being. I see you just as the thing I'm going to use to help me get my end. Now, I think Professor Sider makes a good point here in thinking we have to ask what the alternatives are. If you think about capitalism as perhaps narrowing the moral focus or tending to narrow people's moral focus, what it doesn't do is give people coercive power over others, and that can happen otherwise. So it's better if I see you as a means to my end than to see you as an enemy and kill you. If those are my two choices, I'll take that one. And in fact, if you look at the previous 99% of human history, so before around 1800 or so, what was the default for humanity? Well, Hobbes had it about right: nasty, poor, brutish, and short. So economic historians, there's a fairly good consensus about this for the last 10, 20, 50,000 years. In contemporary dollars, what was the average income per capita worldwide? About less than $1 a day. $1 per day, forever, going back in human history. As long as there have been human beings on the planet, that's about what it was. So if I started to chart for you, ask yourself, that's in contemporary dollars. Could you live on $1 a day? That's not much. You're not going to be able to have that pocket supercomputer that you have that's a global telecommunicator. You can't have things like that, or electricity, or running water. So if I charted it for you, this is what the global wealth looks like. It's like this, less than $1 a day for the entire planet until we get to about 1800, and then it goes like that. Something miraculous happens. So it's about less than $300 per year per person for the last 50,000 years. The last 200 years, it shoots up to historically totally unprecedented levels. Now that's really, Smith was writing, Adam Smith was writing right at that point when something was changing. What's really important for us to figure out, and I think this is actually a moral imperative for us, is to figure out what happened and not jeopardize it. So let me ask you, ladies and gentlemen, what is it? What's the average worldwide per capita income today? So if it was around $300 or so per person per year for almost all of our existence, do you know what it is now? Does anybody know? It's nearly $8,000. Now, $8,000 a year probably doesn't sound like very much to you, compared to $300 a year. And that's going from in 1800, when there were about 100 million people on the planet, to now we have 7 billion people on the planet. So there was some kind of miracle that happened. Now, does that mean that everything that happened was good? No, not by any means at all. But what I would suggest is that if there's any moral imperative now, it's that not enough of the people on the planet have enjoyed this super abundance that we're enjoying. It's not that we should worry about people having too much. It's that there's still people, in fact, there are almost 1 billion people on the planet right now who are still at the historical norm. That's the worry. It's not, I mean, at least from my perspective, and this may be a genuine disagreement that Professor Sider and I have. From my perspective, what's not the problem is that some people have more than others, or some people have less than others. It's that there are some people who are still so low. That's the problem. Let's figure out a way to bring them up. And I think that's the real moral imperative.
That's great. Ron, can I ask you to respond or interact with that? And I'd also be interested in your thoughts on the kinds of values that capitalism tends to promote and the kinds of community we do or don't get in capitalism. How do you think about these things, about what's good and what's bad about capitalism and the values that come with it?
Yeah, well, first of all, I would say that I'm certainly more interested and concerned with the people at the bottom and the $1 billion a day and another $1.5 billion more, $2 a day, than I am about relative inequality. I ask what, in fact, will work best in lifting those people at the bottom. When I think about problems, I said that I think that the right starting point is a market economy. Then one has to ask, how well is that promoting justice? How well is that nurturing a situation where more and more eventually all people have access? It's not being given food, etc., but they have access to the productive resources. They can earn their own way. And I think one has to say, first of all, that the fabulous decrease in the percentage of people who are chronically malnourished that's happened in the last 30 years. It was about 37% in 1970, and now it's, 17, 18%. That's one incredible improvement in the number of people who are chronically malnourished. And that's largely, I think, because of market economies in Asia, where there's been enormous growth in wealth, China, more recently India, and so on. But along with that, you get several problems. For one thing, you get with some frequency an enormous concentration of wealth and power at the top. And conservatives used to be concerned with centralized power. They were worried about that when it was the Soviet Union and communist societies. They don't seem to be concerned in the same way when it's enormous concentrated economic power. But it seems to me a consistency there and a proper biblical understanding grounded in an awareness of the danger of concentrated power ought to mean that they're worried about that as well. You also get an interesting kind of erosion and decline of cultural values in societies that embrace the capitalist system.
What kind of cultural values?
Well, money tends to become, the overriding value and concern for so many. I don't think that's a necessary part of a capitalist system, but it tends to happen. And then, of course, there's the environmental decay that is a part of the contemporary problem. I don't think any of those are insoluble, but they're there, and there are problems, along with the fact that the market economy in itself simply produces what the people with money want. And a third to half of the world's people have virtually no capital, except their own labor, and they have very little ability to, in fact, compete in the market economy. So you have hundreds of millions of people who have no money to buy food, and a market economy produces, the wealthy gadgets and expensive cars and houses, etc., that the rich want, and lets poor kids starve. It seems to me, again, a market economy can handle that, but in fact, that's a part of the current market economy that we live in. So those would be some of the problems that are there.
Absolutely. Did you want to say anything, Jim? I have kind of a follow-up to that.
Go ahead.
Which, one of the things people have talked about a lot in recent years is the decline of community in America. Robert Putnam has written a couple of books about this. Do you see that as connected in any way to a market economy, or I mean, do you agree that that's happened, and if it has happened, do you have a view as to why it's happened?
Yeah, well, that gets to, I think, a really crucial question about the nature of persons. Ayn Rand, who's one of the most famous, persons who's articulated the case for a market economy in American culture in the last 50 years, was a radical individualist, also a very secular anti-Christian person, and she basically said that we have no responsibility for other people. Fundamentally ignored a crucial part of the biblical approach, which is that on the one hand, yes, we are individuals with personal responsibility. Each individual is enormously loved by God. There's a reason why the modern democratic culture and the emphasis on the importance of persons, there's a reason why that emerged in Christian culture, because Christianity says more powerfully than I think any other worldview or religion that every individual matters. Every individual created in the image of God, called to make a choice to live forever with the Lord. I mean, that's an amazing affirmation of that. But the other half is we're communal beings. We don't reach fulfillment unless we are in right relationship with our neighbors. And a very strong concern for the common good is a crucial part of that understanding. And it seems to me that Western culture has become so radically individualistic that it doesn't balance the importance of the person and the individual with an understanding of the common good. And that, of course, is related very much to the question whether or not government has any role in promoting economic justice, in the sense of taking measures which would enable people to genuinely get access to the productive resources. And I think there's a very strong, I think that libertarianism just is flatly unbiblical. There's a strong biblical basis for saying that government has a role in fact, empowering poor people. Now, that's not to say it has the only role. In fact, I want to start with family and institutions in society, in civil society. I was part of George Bush's faith-based initiative. I was very excited about that. I want civil society to do even more, especially churches. But the Bible says that the king, the government, is supposed to do justice. And that's mishpat, is it a con? That includes economic justice in the way I defined it. There's a marvelous passage in Nehemiah where Nehemiah, who's the ruler at this time in Jerusalem, discovers that in a time of famine, very wealthy Jews had seized the land of poor people. Actually, some poor Jews were sold into slavery, And Nehemiah is just absolutely livid. He calls an assembly and he says, give back the land immediately and free these slaves. You know, a clear move of the state to promote economic justice in the sense of everybody having access to the productive resources so they could earn their own way. So I think that it's simply wrong to suppose that all government does is to enforce negative rules so the procedures are fair. I think government also should wisely, and of course some things don't work, so you cut those programs, but wisely do things that enable people to have access to productive resources. That would mean, in our society, making sure that inner city, African American, Latino, and poor white kids had a quality education along with white suburbanites. And there would be a whole variety of other sorts of things, you know, Pell Grants so poor kids can go to college and so on. Always providing access so if people work responsibly, they can earn their own way.
That's really helpful. Jim, can I ask you the same question? Do you feel as though community has declined in this country, and if it has, what are your feelings about why that is? And I'd also love, and if you forget this, I'll re-ask it for you to answer the government question. What role does the government have in addressing these issues?
I think the question of community is a difficult one, because certainly what we are getting is differently ordered communities. Generations are compressing these days with technology, and it's hard. So I'm a college football fan. Have you all heard the story of Manti Te'o, the Notre Dame player, and his fake girlfriend? So apparently he was, I don't know all the details about this, but it's very hard for me to imagine. I'm not that much older, I don't think, than Manti Te'o is, but it seems like an entirely different universe in which people can meet completely online and feel like they have some kind of relationship, maybe a one-on-one, maybe even a relationship in which they feel like they love each other in some deep way, even though they've never physically met. Now the reason I bring that up, so that's very hard for me to imagine.
Yeah, I know. I was waiting.
But you know, I have some kids who tell me, and students who say things like, "Oh yeah, that happens all the time." So the reason I say it's a complicated question is because my first thought in the answer to the question of it is, are communities being eroded in various ways? I think the answer to that sure seems like is yes. But just as Schumpeter said about capitalism, that it's creative destruction, I think you have some creative destruction going on with communities as well. So I'm not willing to say, I guess I just don't know whether the new kinds of communities that are emerging are going to replace. So Putnam's book about bowling alone, maybe some of you have heard or know the argument of bowling alone. These new kinds of social media communities are conspicuously absent. I mean, that's very early. That was in 2000, I think that book came out. Would have been very early. But there's no discussion of those kinds of communities. In that book, it's unclear to me anyway whether these new kinds of communities are going to be able to replace the more traditional physically located communities that have marked human existence before that. But I think there is a different way in which I do worry about our culture. And that is, if we've been able to figure out anything from economic history, it's that there's a very close correlation between economic prosperity, so doing well with wealth and prosperity on the one hand, and trust on the other hand. People have to trust one another implicitly. So if it turns out, and that's a cultural thing, there are some groups of people who are suspicious of each other. And when they're suspicious, they're always, on the one hand, expecting people to engage in opportunism, so lie to them, cheat at the margins, maybe not completely, fulfill the letter, but not the spirit of the agreement you had, on the one hand. And then you have some communities where people have just very high levels of implicit trust. They don't seem to need a specific reason to trust others, they just do. So some of the Scandinavian countries, for example, if you haven't been to Norway, I don't know if you've spent time in Norway, but you'll see what sure seem like, I live in New York City, some things that are very hard to imagine. So you walk down a street in a town in Norway and you'll see that people pushing their baby strollers with the infant in the stroller, they leave the baby stroller with the infant in it outside and go into a store. Just think about that. Because, well, what could possibly happen? And if you say, are you a little worried about this? Gosh, where were you raised? Well, raised in a place that had a little bit less implicit trust. If there is a lesson to learn, it's that culture has a lot to do with the background levels of success. So it's not just the institution, not just the political and economic institutions that lead to generalized prosperity, but it's also the culture. And culture is a complicated, difficult thing. In fact, I don't think we really understand much about what causes cultures to change, what influences cultures. We don't really understand that there's a Nobel Prize out there. Maybe one of you in the audience will win a Nobel Prize if you can figure out what kinds of mechanisms are actually at work in altering culture. The way this comes back to your question, I think your question about community, is that those cultures that have low levels of trust, as opposed to high levels of trust, low levels of trust seem to see the world very much in in-group and out-group terms. There's my group of people and everybody else, and I only trust the people that I personally know. If I don't personally know you, or you don't know someone that I personally know that can vouch for you, I don't trust you. And when you have that sort of dynamic in your culture, what that does is it puts enormous downward pressure on the ability to realize the gains from a market economy.
And could I jump in with a question on the trust, and that is income inequality related at all to trust? I mean, is there a point where income inequality erodes trust, or is that a different issue?
It's a good question. So here's my hypothesis about this. I think equality in itself is not what's so important. But what can be important is if we think inequality is important. Here's what I mean by that. If we think that it's very important to pay attention to whether other people have more than we do, what that does is it turns our attention not to our own lives, making our lives better, other people's lives better, the actual state of people's lives, but rather turns our attention to what are other people doing. And if you spend your time worrying about what are other people doing, keeping up with the Joneses, I have to do what other people are doing, what that does is that can actually create exactly some of the difficult dynamics to improve your own life, and improve the life. So one of the problems that creeps in when we talk about income inequality. So there's an enormous amount of income inequality in America and other Western cultures. That's certainly true. It doesn't follow from that, so if you have person A and person B, suppose person A makes 10 times as much money as person B, 50 times as much money as person B. Does that happen in the United States? Sure. So person A makes 50 times as much money as person B. Does it follow? So let's just stipulate that this is the case. Does it follow from that person B is actually in a bad position? No. So person A can be Warren Buffett. Person B is Oprah Winfrey. So Warren Buffett has about 50 times as much money as Oprah Winfrey. But it sure doesn't follow from that Oprah Winfrey is leading a bad life. But we tend to think that if someone's in an inferior economic position, that relative to someone else, that somehow means that it's a bad position, but that's not the case at all. Here's why I think that's a problem. So what I think is that my hypothesis about this. If what we're paying attention to is not, what's bad about low-income people is the effects of their actual lives. What's not bad about it is that it's less than somebody else's. That's irrelevant. So if we're just looking at the comparison, then we stop paying attention to the things that might actually improve people's lives, which is making their lives better, regardless of where it falls on the scale relative to other people. And so in that way, I think great inequality can begin to cause a problem if we're paying attention to the inequality itself as a thing in itself, as opposed to the conditions of people who are really at the bottom.
Absolutely.
I don't think that the issue of inequality is simply a matter of how I feel about how somebody else is, has a lot more resources. Although I want to start by saying that if it were the case that the best way to improve the lot of the 50, 75 million people toward the bottom of U.S. society, or the billion or 3 billion in the world, if the best way to improve that was to vastly increase inequality, then other things being equal, I wouldn't even be opposed to that. I'm primarily and first of all concerned with a decent life for everyone. And I think that some inequality is not just okay, but in fact morally right. I mean, if people act irresponsibly and there are negative economic consequences, that's a moral outcome. There ought to be costs for making bad decisions about sex and drugs and marriage and so on. And if people are very creative and work hard and they make a lot of money, that too is a just outcome. But we need to be clear on the extent of the inequality in this society, and then I want to make a couple comments about what kind of inequality is, I think, unacceptable. In, I think it was 2004, a few years ago, the richest person in the U.S. had as much income as 120 million people at the bottom. The richest 1% own as much wealth today as the 90% of the people on the quote bottom. From 1993 to 2007, over 50% of all the growth in income in the United States went to the richest 1%. From 2003 to 2007, that 1% got about 65% of all the growth in income. And in 2009 and 2010, the richest 1% got about 93%, according to a recent article in Time, of all the growth in income in the country. The International Monetary Fund has done studies. The U.S. is more unequal now than Western Europe. It's more unequal than at any time in the U.S., except just before the Great Depression in 1928. And the International Monetary Fund has done a study which suggests that, in fact, the Great Depression and the Great Recession of just 2007, 2008 was partly caused by the enormous inequality. And I think it's a different study that suggests that, in fact, the economy grows more quickly when there is less inequality than currently exists. The two kind of criteria, since I've said that I don't think inequality in itself is wrong. One has to ask, how much, and there's no kind of biblical text that tells you that. You have to think from more general principles. And I have two kind of criteria for talking about that. The one is, we know that concentrated power is dangerous in a fallen world because sinful people regularly use enormous power for their own selfish advantage. And so we all ought to be concerned with the kind of inequality that provides enormous unchecked power. And it seems to me that in a situation in the U.S. where the vast majority of money for elections for both parties comes from a very, very tiny group of enormously powerful people who then combine enormous economic and political power, that's getting dangerous, threatening the democracy. Another concern is if inequality is of a nature that it tends to work against a situation where everybody is increasingly able to have access to the productive resources, then it seems to me that inequality is wrong and needs to be corrected. And it seems to me in the current debate, we have a situation where we're told that we don't have the money to provide Pell Grants at $5,500 a year. We're told that they need to be cut by some members of the House to $3,000 a year because we don't have enough money. Well, I mean, we could tax very wealthy people a little more. I'm not interested in going to where it was under Eisenhower, where we had an upper final tax bracket, income tax bracket of 90%. I have no interest in that, even close to that. But a little more money so we can provide quality education for inner city schools would be a good idea. So we can provide Pell Grants and a whole variety of other things that I think tend to empower. Now, some government programs have been counterproductive. They've created dependency. I'm opposed to all of that. I want to change those programs, and I want to have an ongoing exchange with people like Jim and other folk, so we can figure out what programs work and what programs don't. But I think that we ought to be concerned with the kind of inequality that centralizes power the way it is today, and with the kind of inequality that leads to a situation where we are told we don't have the money to, in fact, do good things that would empower poor people.
So I have a bunch more questions that I would love to add, including several that I said, no matter what, I'm going to ask them. So if y'all don't run to the microphone, I'm going to start asking more questions, but it is your turn. So if folks have questions, I think the way we want to do it is line up with the microphone, and we'll just go in order.
Thank you for really provoking us. It was a great model to start with the Q&A back and forth. So it's a model of a debate. Can you imagine what it would mean if every graduate of Eastern College had to participate in a debate, as you were even suggesting, opposite to what they actually believed? Because how much would that contribute to critical thinking? So I just congratulate you on that model of approach.
I stole the idea, but I'll take credit for it.
I do that in one of my courses, as a matter of fact.
I think it is
I do that as well in my course.
Well, critical thinking is probably the most important contribution of higher education if it's accomplished, as opposed to people going out and just thinking that if words sound good, that's enough. So we started talking about the issue of words. You pointed out that actually capitalism was designed by Marx. I don't think our founding fathers, they didn't talk about capitalism. I'm sure that in effect they were talking about things like economic liberty. And in later times, people then transformed that into concepts of free enterprise. To me, those kind of framing of words, because people sometimes don't realize how important the word selection is, to me suggest more the concepts of liberating and empowerment and opportunity when things are framed in the aspect of economic liberty and free enterprise. But I want to go back to the aspect about more and more rich and more poor, or at least a greater divide. What city, big city in America, at least by analysis by the Institute of Justice, was declared to be the most unfair, the most repressive, the most adverse to small business and small business startups in the United States? Philadelphia. It is so hard to be able to get business licenses, not only in terms of the delay, the longer it takes to even just get a business license itself leads to corruption, because people who might have a little bit of energy get frustrated and they start to pay things under the table. But in the greater sense, you can't get effective capital formation, even borrowing money from relatives and so on, if you have all the other encumbrances. Some of you, at a certain age, may have had a variety of different jobs, including selling lemonade on the corner. Anybody who's 50 or 60 or above ever sold lemonade on a street corner? Most cities, including places like Philadelphia, I'm sorry, 10-year-old, where's your $300 business license? That's the culture that we're living in terms of what's inequality, is what's the traditional resurgence in America of people starting up like Thomas Edison, who started very small, and all the other people, McCormick, the Wright brothers, and so on. Most of them never even had college education, but they lived in a system which was, where's the opportunity? Well, you have the opportunity. Nobody's telling you what you can't do. Nobody's trying to regulate you. I think that's a much more powerful factor in terms of income disparity. In fact, we are having something now in the United States of the favoritism of government to big business, friends that they have alliances with. How much taxes do you think General Electric paid last year? Who was the leading so-called private enterprise advisor to this administration? It's the CEO of GE. And they just passed in this thing where they sort of staved off going off the cliff to propagate the GE could be able to take all their profits, which was over $5 billion last year, and send it abroad and pay no tax at all.
So let me.
So I just want
get
to
a
say
quick-
this system is suppressing particularly the surgeons on the bottom, the people who are most hurt, and I would say probably that which has turned around most recessions has been the vigor and restoration of small business. The man who formed Home Depot said he could never start Home Depot today because he began as a small businessman.
Let me.
I think that's the
We need
genesis.
to give them a chance to respond. Ron, would you?
Well,
like to-
I would just say that just because I think there's a role for government doesn't mean that I think that all government regulations are wise, and one needs to ask that. Hernando Soto, talked about the way that all kinds of regulations, he was in Peru, wasn't he? Were counterproductive and prevented precisely that development of small business persons. I'm sure that there are vested interests in Philadelphia that have provided that have created a whole bunch of regulations that hinder exactly what you're talking about. And I would want to talk about how you change and improve that. I don't think that means that there's no role for government, but it has to be wise and has to be designed to empower people.
Do you want to add anything?
Can I say something quickly about that? A practical, not necessarily a morally principled, but a practical reason to be wary of a government that distributes wealth, even for good purposes, with good intentions, is the following. It was raised by David Hume, who was a friend of Adam Smith's in the 18th century. Hume said, if you have an apparatus that is empowered to take wealth from one set of pockets and put it in another, for good reasons, it will inevitably be commandeered by people who do not have good purposes in mind. And that's because there are inevitably people who would rather satisfy their own interests and those of their family and friends and their cohorts by taking money from you than from earning it in the marketplace, because it's hard to earn it in the marketplace. So we might distinguish on the one hand the power, you mentioned power, concentration of power. Think of the power that Bill Gates had. You know who Bill Gates was? Well, he's still out there, sort of. But there was a time not too long ago when people worried about the power that Bill Gates had, because Microsoft was approaching 80% of the market share. You always could say no to Bill Gates. No matter how much money he had, you could always buy something else. That kind of power, the power of business, although it is certainly powerful, he could drive a very hard bargain with his distributors, he could drive a very hard bargain with his employees, but every one of those people all the way along the chain, up and down, including the consumers, could always say no. That can't happen once you erect certain kinds of things into law. So the petty bureaucrat who says you don't get to have your lemonade stand unless you pay $350, that person's making $18,000 a year or whatever it is. Bill Gates can't open a lemonade stand without that person's permission. That's a totally different category of power. And that's something to worry about greatly, I think.
Yeah, that's certainly, I worry about that danger too, but the other side is that there are also powerful private oppressors. I mean, the Bible talks about the king restraining oppressors, and there are private oppressors that are hurting people. On the positive side,
Who do you have in mind? Do you have someone in mind now?
you mean current oppressors?
A current private oppressor.
No, I was talking about.
In biblical times.
No, I'm sure we could agree on, or probably couldn't agree, but anyway.
I want to know. Who do you have in mind?
But what I wanted to say is, remember that although government action can lead and does and has to negative consequences of the sort you talked about, it also has done powerful things for the common good. I mean, it was taxation of some people that produced the land-grant colleges that were enormously important in helping millions and millions of farmers do well. The GI Bill was taxing some people so that other people could go to college. One can go on and on, Pell Grants, and talk
I don't
about
think there's
effective
no
government
one who
programs.
claims. Well, I don't know. I would say no one. I'm certainly not. I certainly wouldn't claim that government can't do any good or has never done any good. That's almost never the question.
And
The
I
question
wouldn't
is
say
always
that it never does bad.
the question is always relative to what, at what cost. At what potential risk? So that's always the question. It's never, have there been, is the Hoover Dam a good thing? Or have good things come from public schooling or from, of course. Are there any other ways that those things could potentially have been done? Maybe. But that's really the interesting question, to me anyway. The interesting question is, what are we potentially giving up? What are the other alternatives? What are the potential costs? And oftentimes in conversations about whether the government should take over, should regulate in various ways, that part of the question just never comes up. What are the opportunity costs? What are the things that might have otherwise been done? What are the potential costs to localized communities when the state takes over the role of helping your neighbor who needs help? And I think about that, maybe some of you think about that as well. I would like to be able to take responsibility. I think it is my own moral responsibility to help when my neighbor needs help. But if there's an agency that comes in and says, not only, no, don't worry about it, we'll take care of it, but says, you may not take care of it, which often happens. So were you around when Sandy hit? Right now, still, there are people trying to recover from what happened from the Sandy storm, and there are local, state, and federal agencies that are preventing private enterprises, private people from helping. You may not help. That's our job. That's a very worrisome thing. So the question is not, can they do good? Of course they can do good, but the question is, what are we giving up in exchange for it? Maybe we should allow we've been talking
we've
about
got
that.
more questions coming. Sure.
In 1990, which was 6 months after I joined Jack's father's firm as a portfolio manager, the United Nations put out a goal to have global poverty by 2015. And just recently, Spectator magazine put an article out there that said that they had achieved that actually in 2008, well ahead of schedule. And the United Nations didn't make a big fuss about that, the Spectator claimed, because it was done because capitalism worked. And I actually, by being virtual, working for Jack's dad's firm, I was participating in that. I saw that happen. I was providing the capital to a lot of these poor countries where that were causing businesses to grow and jobs to be created and people to be pulled out of poverty. So it was a great experience to see that, and pleasure to be part of that. I was asked to speak at something similar to this at Yale Theological Seminary several years back, and I pointed that out, that capitalism was actually the greatest lever of poverty. And of course the student body that was there kind of laughed at me. I was up against a Catholic nun and she made fun of me and that kind of stuff, but it was actually true.
Don't go against the Catholic.
That's right. I couldn't possibly win that argument, It was like, you can't go back and beat up the Catholic nun. So I had to leave it where it was. But I was struck by the fact that the student body had no conception. Now, I've been encouraged by you not being a communist, Carl, and some of the kind things. I probably heard Carl Henry say that 30 years ago, so I've spent the last 30 years thinking you're pretty much a communist, unfortunately. I apologize for that. But anyway, I've been impressed by the fact that you said that there's a role for the markets and all that. I'm just wondering, given that statistic, if it's accurate, it's reported by Spectator magazine, can anybody, any of the panelists, think of a better system or a better way, a way in which we could have more quickly alleviated global poverty than the capitalist system, with all its inherent flaws, which I would be the first one to acknowledge or amend?
Well, one thing I would say at that point is, first of all, I don't know a better, general system for running the economic order, and I'm in favor of starting there. But it seems to me that all of the Asian tigers, for example, that were kind of the early examples of embracing a market economy and global trade, South Korea and Hong Kong and Singapore, Taiwan, that in each case you had both a general embrace of market economy and an embrace of global trade and a significant role for government. In South Korea, the land was distributed so that all the farmers owned their own land. Both in terms of education and healthcare, those governments invested significantly. So it seems to me that the lesson from Asia in terms of how to produce economic development that affects and lifts vast numbers of people is that the right kind of partnership between government and private enterprise is crucial. It's certainly not that totally unrestricted private enterprise is the way for that to happen. But it also is not that a government control of all the economy is the way.
Can I ask you a real quick question? Given the left's kind of
Given what?
the left, the liberals,
Yeah.
you know, your base's kind of distrust of the capitalist system.
I don't accept that, but go ahead.
Okay, well, I'll just leave it at that. They don't accept it, but you know, can we form that something like that, what you've just described, which has happened in other countries here in the United States, where it seems like as a small businessman right now, I of course feel under attack by our government, and it's not a partnership certainly.
Yeah. I mean, I don't start with a negative attitude toward private ownership and free enterprise. I think that's the right framework. And then you have to ask what kind of government activity needs to be present to pick up things that can't be solved that way. And that's always a pragmatic, prudential question.
Sure, but let's let the other.
I just wanted to preface by saying thank you each for your time this evening. I had a question pertaining to one of Dr. Sider's remarks, and I'd be interested in hearing all of your perspectives on this. When you mentioned the king having the responsibility to administer justice both in the economic sense and also in the sort of judicial sense of appropriate outcome for justice, I'm interested in knowing, specifically on the economic front, how does the government, how should the interaction look between the government and the private sector in administering economic justice, as it were, rather than saying just, you know, having like a department to, you know, administer aid in the case of a natural disaster or something like that? What should the interaction look like between the government and the private sector? And as sort of a follow-up to that, what is the role of the church in that kind of environment? And do you see any danger in the government trying to take on, maybe as a Christian, what would be the role of the church in trying to administer economic justice?
Sure, of course there's a danger in government becoming too powerful. You know, I've got a book called Just Politics where I talk about, you know, the political realm from a biblical, my understanding of biblical perspective. And one of the things I insist on is limited government, absolutely crucial. And also that the institutions in civil society, family, church, are all crucial. I would like to see stronger and stronger response to poverty on the part of the institutions of civil society.
And would you see a way for the government to enable that?
Oh, sure. That's what the faith-based initiative that Bush was famous for and that Obama continued is trying to do. We ought to have more of that. The more we can do through non-governmental institutions, the happier I am, because they're closer to the people. They can provide spiritual transformation as well as socioeconomic transformation. They're less bureaucratic. So the more we can do it that way, the better. But take one issue. You know, tens of thousands of Christian and other private agencies provide food aid every week to people who need food aid. Do you know what percentage of all the food aid in a given month comes from private agencies? What from government? 6% comes from private agencies, 94% comes from government. It's just silly to suppose that private agencies can take over all that. But the more they can do efficiently, the more government can contribute to that, the happier I am.
That's partly a causal relationship, of course.
Exactly.
I mean, you have to remember also that human beings respond to incentives. You get more of what you pay for. If you subsidize people, it lowers the cost to them of certain kinds of behaviors. There's no question that a lot of what goes on, it's very hard for private agencies to compete with the government. One of the things that governments are good at is distributing cost. They can localize benefits and distribute costs, which makes it seem as though programs to help people are virtually costless to the people. So it's an enormous benefit we can confer. We distribute the cost, a hundredth of a penny to every citizen. So it's very easy to do that. But what the other side of that coin, if you like, is that it also distributes risk. In other words, people are marginally, at the margins, they are encouraged to engage in behaviors that they otherwise would not engage in if they themselves had to bear the risk of the full cost of their behaviors. Having government agencies that will give you various kinds of aid regardless of the decisions you make enables people, psychologically, it gives them exactly the mental ammunition they need to keep engaging in those exact behaviors. So if you say, well, we have this level of aid that we're going to give you, but it's no surprise that people will rise to that level. Then you raise it up higher, well, they'll rise back up to that level as well. This is something that goes on in human nature. One of the tremendous benefits of relying on private agency. So I spend a lot of time with Catholic Charities. My wife and I spend a lot of time with Catholic Charities. One of the great blessings for me about that is that when someone needs help, I sit across the table and look them in the eye, and I say, let's figure out what we can do together. That's exactly what's missing in the government agencies. There's no humanity, no paying attention to personhood. You're treated like a number, you're treated like an obstacle, you're treated like a problem to solve. When you come and ask me for help at my little desk, you come in, you say, I need help with my phone bill, I can't pay my phone bill, I can't buy diapers, let's figure it out. Now we're human beings dealing with each other as human beings. That's the creation of community. There's no government in that. In fact, if the government had its way, it would prevent that from happening because it makes it much easier for people to get money without having to look me in the eye, without having to say to me or to say to my wife, well, I'm maybe spending too much time on this and maybe we could change our behaviors and do this other thing. That's a real source of human community, and I think that's absolutely washed away when you encourage the government from Washington, D.C. Of all places. My God, you know what the people in Washington, D.C. are like? You want to put those people in charge of ministering to communities? The worst possible solution.
Okay, so we're almost out of time, but hopefully we can get in several more questions if we're kind of quick.
Thank you guys for coming. Maybe just one quick comment and then a question. Just a counterpoint to your comment about libertarianism. I'm not quite sure how a society ordered around non-coercion and non-aggression is unbiblical. The idea being that you shouldn't do to others what you wouldn't have them do to you, which is the founding idea of classical liberalism and then what has become libertarianism. So if you want to respond, you can. But and then the lead in my second question is, or my question, I guess, is it just seems odd to me that we would want to invest more power and more. So like on one hand, we're saying we don't want to centralize power, but yet we look at the history of the modern totalizing state, which starts somewhere between the French Revolution and the Lincoln era, which seeks only to centralize, which is a bigger discussion, which coincidentally their favorite way, it seems to me, of ending poverty is to kill people, with the 240 million people they killed last century. But I'm curious what you guys would respond, both to the role of the Federal Reserve and the debasement of currency, particularly I think from Dr. Sider, because the interest in having the government involved in the economy, I think it's the sort of elephant in the room of what I would say is one of the most destructive things to the poor, which is the debasement of their dollars. So as their Federal Reserve essentially is engaging in buying debt from the government and printing fiat currency, which is currency not linked to any substance that has real value. In doing so, they're stealing value from everyone else, including all of us, but particularly the poor, because they're the last to receive those dollars as they make their way to the economy. Not to mention how it disrupts interest rates.
Can you be quick with the question?
Yeah. So anyways, I'm just curious, the moral sort of implications as Christians of a totalizing state that is debasing its currency, and what that would mean, I guess, in terms of the poverty in this country.
Great, thanks.
I won't talk about the Federal Reserve and the gold standard, but I will say that I think we're a long way from the totalizing state in this country. There are certainly some points where we need to be vigorous and concerned and watchful, but we're nowhere close to what we've seen in the Soviet Union and China, and to suggest otherwise is just silly.
Quickly, reply, Jim, and then
You mind if I ask, how old are you?
25.
25. So your share of the total national debt is about $750,000 right now. That's not a good way to treat our young people, is it? Not a good way to treat anybody. My youngest child is 6 years old. His current share of the net present value of our total indebtedness is $1.3 million. That's money that other people spent on things that they are enjoying. He'll have no benefit from it. He's just gonna have to pay it off.
Is that including future liability?
It's all that's the total national debt, which is about 16.5 trillion.
Not including the other 100 trillion.
It's including, well, there are estimates about that, but if you think of the net present value of our total indebtedness, which includes Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, and Obamacare, if you put that at about 62 trillion, your 100 trillion number is so high, although not completely unreasonable, but if it's 60, I mean, we're talking about monopoly, right? $62 trillion, that means for an age, someone who's 20 years old, I have the exact number here, if you're 20, which is the average age of a college student, it's about $855,000 right now, if the government does not spend another penny to go in further in debt, which, by the way, they're doing all the time. That's not a good way to run an economy, and it's certainly not a good way to treat other human beings, Christianly or otherwise, I would say.
So, Jake, last question.
I'm a leader of the largest inner city Christian school in Philadelphia. We're the only K-12 Christian school in Philadelphia. And we're in the
Only
midst.
one?
What's that?
There's only one?
There's only one. And 1.5 million people.
You're not counting Catholic schools then?
I'm not counting Protestant Christian schools, correct.
Okay.
Thank you for that clarification, I appreciate that. You beat my sales pitch, darn it. Okay, so anyway, we talked about the need to differentiate personal responsibility and balanced community. Education, as I experience it, is in tumult related to market forces. Private and public sector, and education also serves as a critical cultural lever. So I sort of exist in a place where there is market economy that's being discussed, how you balance personal responsibility within community, and that also is a means for affecting culture. So I just appreciate your comments on education as a case study for these different discussions that we've had.
I think this is one of the most crucial things about if we want genuine access to capital for everybody, because knowledge is the basic capital in an information society. Frankly, I'm in favor of major testing to test educational vouchers, and whichever, whether improving the public school systems or educational vouchers, whichever works better for minority kids and poor kids, I'm in favor of that. That would be my real quick comment.
That's great. I would say one other thing I think is very important to teach. It doesn't take a lot of money, and that's to teach, to give people a moral basis. Keep your hands to yourself. Don't take things from other people. Stand on your own 2 feet. If you imagine that as a moral exemplar, the kind of human being you should be, regardless of what field you go into, regardless of what you end up becoming, stand on your own 2 feet. Don't live at the expense of other people. Don't expect other people to take care of you. Keep your promises. These are very simple things, and the internalization of that very simple moral code, I think, is really what made America the wealthiest and freest country in the history of the world. And at the moment, we're also the most in-debt country in the history of the world. And that's partly because we've forgotten exactly those values. That's not something I think that takes a lot of money. Although I'm glad to hear you say about vouchers. I'm in favor of vouchers as well. But just teaching that simple lesson, stand on your own 2 feet, keep your promises, keep your hands to yourself. That's very simple. If we could get people to internalize that, boy, we'd be in a much better position than I think the one we're sort of getting ready to go in now.